Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I am Monique Sultani, the host and creator of Wine OTV, and welcome to the Commonwealth Club. One of the things I love about wine is that it brings people together and it connects us, and I am so privileged and honored to be here together with you all here today and be connected. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker. He has a wonderful resume, and I'm going to read it because it's long. Ray Isle is the author of The World in a Wine Glass, The Insider's Guide to Artisanal, Sustainable, Extraordinary Wines to Drink Now. Ray is the longtime executive wine editor for Food & Wine, as well as the wine and spirits editor for Travel & Leisure, and he writes Food & Wine's monthly What to Drink Now column. Ray has won the IACP Award for Narrative Beverage Writing 3 times, the American Food Journalist Award for Beverage Writing, the North American Travel Journalists Association Gold Award, and has been nominated 3 times for a James Beard Award in Beverage Writing. Wow, Ray, this is incredible. I am honored to be here with you today. Give it up for Ray.
A little bit the Susan Lucci of the Beard Awards.
Oh, the Susan Lucci. Well, you'll get one after this, probably for the book.
Yeah,
obviously, Ray's book brought us all here together. There is so much in this book that resonated with me personally through my own journey. It's 600 pages. I bet it could be 6,000 pages because there's so many incredible stories to tell. One of the things that really hit home with me was your theme about storytelling and the people, the place behind the bottle that matter. And with that, I would love to start with your story, your personal journey of how you got into wine.
Yeah, so I didn't grow up with wine. It wasn't a part of my, I didn't grow up drinking it as a child, strangely enough.
That is strange.
But I go figure. But I didn't grow up with really in my family. I remember we would have wine on the table at Thanksgiving or at Christmas, and that was about it. My father drank, I grew up in Texas. My father drank beer and bourbon, more or less, which is not to make him come off as like a farmer in Texas. He was an English professor, but nevertheless.
Hence the writing.
The sole moment of excitement about an alcoholic beverage I remember as a child was the day that Coors became available, like east of the Rockies, and he was very psyched. It's like, Coors, this is so cool. But what happened was I went. I did not have any interest in wine through college. My sole memory of wine in college was lying on the floor at a party and someone squeezing wine into my mouth from a bag.
A bag? Wine? Wait, hang on now.
Well, it was a box, but you pull the bag out of the box, and then and that apparently is preparation for being a wine writer. But what happened was in grad school in Boston, I kind of got interested in wine. Toward the end of my graduate career there, my girlfriend was working at a high-end restaurant in Boston and then in Providence, and so she knew something about wine, and I started getting interested in it and got a little more interested. Where I worked in a rare bookstore in D.C. for a while and kind of had a lot of spare time sitting at a table waiting for customers, and I would read about wine, and the thing that turned the switch for me or lit the light bulb or whatever metaphor you want to use, it's true for a lot of people in the wine business that there's like a moment with a wine that does it. And for me, it was a 1984 Diamond Creek Volcanic Hill Cabernet Sauvignon, which I had probably in 1990, I guess. And it was at a dinner with that former girlfriend and her father, and he had been to the winery and bought the wine. And I remember being at this dinner at this restaurant called Restaurant Nora in D.C. and taking a sip or two of the wine, taking another sip and thinking, this is really good, and taking another few sips and being like, this wine is amazing. And I remember absolutely nothing of the dinner of talking to my girlfriend or her father, and I remember absolutely that wine and remember very clearly getting to the bottom of the glass and having that last sip left. Anybody who loves wine knows that feeling where you get to the end of the glass and there's one sip left, and you're like, that's it. That's like, I've got to either drink it or not drink it or wait. And so probably the relationship disintegrated because I wasn't paying attention to either of them.
Yeah, clearly. You only remember the wine.
But I do remember the wine. And then the next thing that happened was that, and that probably would have been it. I probably would have just been interested in wine and so on, except I got a writing fellowship out here at Stanford, and that is that slippery slope. It put me next to wine country, and yeah, it's a dangerous situation. I started going to wineries, as one does, going to Napa, tasting wine. I found out from the people I was occasionally buying wine from on my graduate student $14 a week budget. I was buying wine at K&L, and one of the guys was like, you can volunteer for bottlings for little wineries, and they'll pay you in wine. And if your budget's $14 a week, then that's kind of like, all right, well, that's cool. So I started doing that. That transformed into working Harvest for 2 years as a cellar rat and switching my teaching schedule around so I could work Harvest in the fall and then teach the rest of the year. And then after that, I was like,
You're hooked.
I'm not going to be in academia. I'm going to be in wine one way or another. I had no idea if the writing and the wine would come together, but it was very clear that I was taking a hard left turn into that world. And then I ended up in New York and selling wine, selling port, one of the more thankless tasks that there is in the wine business. I'm convinced there are still bottles of port that I sold to restaurants around 2000 that are still on the shelf where they landed when I sold them, because nobody buys port these days, which is a terrible shame. And if my former boss, Peter Scott, is in the audience, Peter, I'm sorry, I did my best. And I sold wine, and Josh Green at Wine and Spirits read a freelance piece I had written, and got in touch with me about writing for him, and pretty soon that was a job offer, and I haven't looked back.
Well, you've crafted quite the career for yourself. Obviously, that is enough to be celebrated. But then to go on and write such an incredible, heavy but really interesting book. I promised my 8-year-old I would ask this question first. So what inspired you to write a book this big, this heavy, and really this meaningful?
Well, so I didn't actually set out to write a book that big. I set out to write a book, but I didn't expect to write a 700-page book. I've been at Food and Wine now since 2005. I thought about doing books over the years, but I knew I didn't want to do another sort of introduction to wine book. There are a lot of them. There are a lot of very good ones. It seemed like there didn't need to be another. I didn't really want to do something regional. And I'd gotten more and more interested over time in essentially in a couple of things, in people who were working or farming in ways that were beneficial to the environment rather than detrimental to it. So anybody who was working sustainably, organically, regeneratively, biodynamically, all that. There was sort of a moment where, and if people are in the wine business, and I don't know how many people out in the audience are in the business or not in the business, but there's been a kind of a conflict between the world of natural wine and the world of traditional wine, I guess you'd say. And natural wine is this deeply low intervention school of winemaking, but a lot of the producers I like in the conventional world of wine are also working in a very low intervention way with very little sulfur and organic, farming and so on. And it's kind of like, well, to me, this barrier where these two schools are criticizing each other isn't really the wall. The wall, or the problem to me, is the world of mass-produced industrial, agrochemically farmed, 100,000-gallon tank, basically, wine as a beverage product versus wine that is made by people on land that they have an investment in, who are often living on that land and are farming in ways that benefit the environment and are making wines that really express the place they're from and the personal vision of who's making them. And when all that kind of came together, it was like, okay, well, that seems like a book. And then it got to be a really big book because it really could have been 8,000 pages because there are so many small wineries out there making really wonderful wines that I had to limit it.
Not to cut you off, but that was what I think is so incredible. People don't really realize that it could have been 8,000 pages because there are that many people doing wines in this incredible way, like you're saying. And a lot of times we're not made aware of those wines. And your book did a really great job of doing that.
Thank you.
How did you narrow it down to only the people you put in here?
A couple of filters, because one filter was my editor who said, no, you cannot do an 8,000-page book about wine. That's not what we paid for, and don't.
And who could lift it?
And no one can lift it, and we will sell no copies ever. So, but the short version, there's no one in that book that I haven't talked to personally, whether visiting the winery or or interviewing them in New York when they were through on a wine tour, or a sort of exception made for the pandemic because there's some Zoom interviews because some of my travel plans strangely were disrupted by the pandemic.
Yours were?
Yeah,
Huh.
I don't know.
It
It's
was
the
so
strangest
strange.
goddamn thing. You know?
Okay, well, we can't relate, none of us, so go on.
Yeah, so it's only people I've spoken with. It's primarily wines that are under $100. There are some producers who make wines that are above that, but the bulk of the wines in the book, I wanted to be a book full of wines that people could actually go out and buy, and that, for instance, Domaine Romanée-Conti works in all the ways that the book is about, is owned by two families who don't always get along, but it's owned by two families. But the least expensive wine they make is $2,500 a bottle. I don't know, that seems like maybe that's not the thing I need to write about. And additionally, thousands of pages have been written about Domaine Romanée-Conti, so why not write about some smaller producers that don't have thousands of pages written about them? And then, so those two things, and then to a certain degree, I wanted to cover the world, but so I couldn't, if you want to cover the world, you can't do 200 profiles of Chianti producers,
Sure.
because then you've got an 8,000-page book. So I had to kind of be a little ruthless and trim down and leave out some people that I loved. And sometimes it was because the research I'd done, I pulled on some research from years past in food and wine, but some of it was too old. A lot of people, were too expensive, left them out.
And so I'd like to go back to this, the category you started about why you started writing about this. Originally, obviously, this idea of natural wine, organic wines, regenerative viticulture,
Right.
all these different areas that I think we all hear about. And I told you over the phone when we talked earlier this week, I've probably interviewed 10 different winemakers about the same topic, and you always get a different answer. So I'm curious, for you dedicated a whole book to it. Can you just tell us what each of those things mean when we go get a wine right now?
Yeah, absolutely,
Thank
for sure.
you.
That's simple. Easiest way is buy the book.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I did try and simplify, or let's see how to put this. I tried to write explanations of those categories in a way that was clear and not overly technical, but was also accurate. And it's very complicated because different countries have different rules about all those things, and different labeling rules for sure. And then there's a question of organic, et cetera, viticulture versus winemaking. And so essentially, to nutshell it very, very, very broadly, sustainability is an approach when it's followed, when it's not BS, is trying to keep the environment of the vineyard sustainable. It also involves treating workers, in a manner that's not damaging, and then taking into account things like sustainability of the environment as a whole, so carbon reduction, using solar power, all that kind of thing. It applies to farming, but it looks out beyond the farming methods into other things as well. Organics is a form of agriculture where you do not use, essentially you solve problems in your vineyard, whether it's diseases or mold pressure or whatever, without systemic chemicals. So you're not using the sort of agrochemicals like Roundup that you would normally use. You're using sulfur, you're using copper sulfate and things like that, which are, of course, themselves chemicals, but they're at least naturally occurring. Biodynamics is interesting. So biodynamics is a form, the easiest way to describe biodynamics is it's a philosophy of agriculture that looks at the vineyard or the farm, let's say, as an ecological whole. So not just the vines, but the vines, the bugs, the animals that live in the vineyard, the dirt, the microbiological life in the dirt are all one interconnected thing. And so you treat it with products or treatments or whatever that reinforce life in the entirety of that context. Now, biodynamics comes from some philosophical writings by Rudolf Steiner, a very unusual, somewhat weird Austrian theosophist from the late 1800s, early 1900s, who also founded the Waldorf school system. There are some aspects of biodynamics that kind of bring in the cosmic forces.
I heard them talking about the moon and the
Yeah.
stars, and it can get a little.
It can get a little woo-woo, as they say. And you know, if you bury a cow horn full of manure, so there's various biodynamic treatments that you use homeopathically in the vineyard. One, for instance, is you bury a cow horn full of manure for 6 months. You unearth it in the spring. You atomize the contents of the cow horn in water, and you spray it over the vineyard. The Steiner felt that the pointed tip of the cow horn concentrated astral forces into the contents of the horn. A little bit weird.
I didn't know we're going to get all in the weeds there with that.
But
That's
on the
good.
other
I didn't
hand-
know about the horn.
Yeah, the horn is great. But on the other hand, there's something to it in that, you know, if you smell the manure that has been buried for 6 months, it doesn't smell like cow manure anymore. It smells like this very rich, earthy substance that has undergone some kind of transformation, and it's probably more microbiological than it is astral, but who knows. My favorite quote in the book about biodynamics is from Olivier Zind-Humbrecht, who at Zind-Humbrecht, appropriately, winery in Alsace, who is trained as he has a master's degree in enology and viticulture. He is a master of wine. He is a deeply rational and very scientifically trained person who farms biodynamically. And what he did when he started working biodynamically was create 2 separate vineyard plots, one that was biodynamic, one that was not. He created different manure piles, some that were treated biodynamically, some that were not. And for instance, with the manure piles, he measured the microbiological life in the manure pile in the biodynamic and in the non-biodynamic. And you know, what he said was that the amount of life in the biodynamically treated pile of manure was just massively larger than in the other. And what he said was, you know, I look at this scientifically. The fact that if I can measure a difference, but I can't explain it, that doesn't mean the difference isn't there. In fact, that's the nature of science, is you try and figure out why there is something going on that you can't understand. So if I can measure that there's a difference, that's enough for me. I don't have to necessarily be able to explain it. And the history of humanity is trying to explain things we don't understand, and we don't understand everything yet. And I thought that was a really smart response to biodynamics, and a number of very, very, very good vintners who are very smart work that way. Regenerative agriculture is kind of a combo platter of sustainability and the biodynamics without the spiritual aspect. So treating the environment as a whole, working, and at the same time working on things like carbon sequestration and also treating your farm animals correctly, treating your workers with respect, having them have input into the way the vineyard is run. And it's, you know, some people, the shorthand, regenerative is kind of the new flavor on the block, and some people schedule, you know, biodynamics without the woo-woo. But regardless, it's a combo of both farming strategies and other things that you do that are beneficial to both the culture and the environment. And for instance, Tablas Creek in Paso Robles was the first California, and maybe the first vineyard in the world, to be certified regenerative organic viticulture. And it's an interesting approach. I mean, all of this stuff is trying to look at how to farm in a way that, you know, farming is man interacting with the environment. Farming is not nature on its own does not farm. Nature on its own does what it does. We interact with nature when we farm things, but you can interact in a way. I think I quote Wendell Berry in the book. I actually have a short background information. My parents went to Stanford. My dad was there at the same time Wendell Berry was there. If anyone knows Wendell Berry, wonderful essayist about nature, wonderful poet. I have a picture of myself sitting on Wendell Berry's knee when I was 4, but in one of his essays, he wrote about how there's a give and take between man and nature when it comes to agriculture. Ideally, it's a give and take. A lot of industrial agriculture is just a take. It says we take what we want from nature. Ideally, it should be kind of an interactive process. And all of these approaches are, to me, ways to work with nature to farm and create a crop, as opposed to working despite nature, or working to control nature.
Well, and one of the things I loved in your book, you talked about that there's life in the soil and then
Yeah.
there's soul in it. And when you use these products, you're really just crushing the life out of the soil, and we're not thinking of it as a living thing that is impacting the wine that we drink.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's Steve Mathiasen, who's going to be pouring later on. We were having a conversation about this, and he was saying, that one of the things about something like Roundup is not that it kills the microbiological life in the soil, that it kills all the, kills the cover crop, it kills everything on the surface that in fact that contributes to the microbiological life. So it's like instead of killing all the bacteria in the soil, you starve them to death with it, which is an interesting and kind of bleak assessment, but true. One of the big topics in wine right now is a kind of an understanding that terroir, this expression of place through the nature of wine, through the way a wine tastes and the way you get it, you don't really get terroir unless you have living soil. If you've got dead soil, you don't really have terroir expression in the same way. And a lot of these approaches to farming are all about keeping your soil alive and keeping that microbiological life going.
And, I think it's interesting, and obviously you think it's important because you wrote a whole book about it. And when we think about what we eat, we often say we are what we eat, and now we are what we drink. Do you feel the industry is moving along these lines where this is increasingly more important to them as it is with food?
Yeah, I think, the industry moves, a couple of things. One, consumers are more interested in it, and wine is something that people sell. And so if consumers are interested in it, that will kind of push that along. I think, as I just talking to people out there who drink wine, it definitely skews younger. Younger consumers are more concerned about how was this grown, how was it made, and and I'm putting it in my body. What does that mean? Wine trends on that kind of character tend to trail after food trends. So there's been a lot of interest in over quite a few years now about how the food we're putting in our body and how it was grown and so on. But it's been kind of like, I think as one of the winemakers in the book says, it's like people go to Whole Foods and they buy the organic produce and they make very clear, very sure that they're buying, foods that aren't going to, be covered in pesticides. And they get to the wine aisle and they're like, what the hell? And grab a bottle of wine.
They can say it, right? And
it's
$15.
Like, okay, whatever.
Okay,
I don't know, $15
good.
seems like a good deal. And so I think that's changing a little bit, which is interesting. And it's one reason why I did the book now, I think, is because of interest in it. That's part of it, at least. There was a second part to that question I completely spaced.
Well, on to the next. There's so much to get to. One of the things I thought was really incredible, too, is that not only are we talking about wines that are made in this, from artisanal producers in an eco-friendly way, but there's value in the wine. So you're not finding, $500 bottles in here. Most of them are under $100. And talk about that, the quality for value.
Well, most of them are in the sort of $20 to $40 zone. And I said somewhere in the book that you can live your entire life drinking wine under $100 and have an absolutely extraordinary life of drinking wine. You won't miss the fact that you didn't drink a $500 Corton Charlemagne or whatever. And so I didn't. I kind of wanted the wines in the book to be accessible, and I didn't think there was any dilution of quality by looking at wines you could afford. Most of what I do for food and wine is wines that are in the affordable zone, and that's not realistically. It's hard to make $5 wines if you're doing a lot of handwork in the vineyard. It's not, it's tricky. That's sort of where you get into economy of scale, and your average $5 wine is not going to be farmed by hand organically. But you do, and they're not in the book. But Bonterra, for instance, farms 1,000 acres or something organically, and you can do, and their wines are not terribly expensive at all, so you can do it at scale. But I wanted the wines to be findable and affordable. The nature of the way wine is sold in the U.S. is that not every wine will be in every store. Unless you're, take your pick of mass-produced wines, but. It takes a little hunting. Someday, if our wine laws change, then, wine is the only product I can think of that Amazon like tried to get into and then called it quits.
Forget it.
They were like, okay, this is just way too much trouble.
They bought
You
One
know.
Medical, but
Yeah.
they couldn't deal
They
with the
couldn't
wine
deal with
category,
wine.
right?
They were
Exactly.
defeated by wine, and it's the one time Jeff Bezos was like, "Nope,
I'm good.
out, we're done."
Well, I love in the book at the end, you literally say, one of the parts, it was towards the end, where you say, do you want to know how you can get these wines? Because most of them you're not going to find. Go to your local wine store, be an advocate for what you want, and hopefully you'll see it.
Yeah, I mean, it's I have said for years and years and years, and I completely believe it, that the best way to buy wine is to find a store that's run by people who love wine, who will talk to you about what you like. And that was my experience at K&L years ago when I was getting into wine. I didn't have a huge amount of money to spend, that they would take time and ask me what I'd had before and suggest things. And it was, you may pay $1 more than you do at Kroger or whatever, but you get so much information out of it that it's worth it. And it's the independent wine stores of the world are a great boon to anyone who loves wine.
Yeah, and also touching on the lesser known wine regions, which I know you do. Obviously,
Yeah.
real estate is prices of wine are reflective of how much the land costs. So if you can, shine the spotlight on some of these lesser known regions.
Yeah, and there's also tricks. You can use winesearcher.com to if anybody doesn't know winesearcher.com, handy thing. Type in the name of wine, your zip code, it'll tell you who sells it near you. Ideally, one trick I've learned from researching for food and wine is you type the name of a wine, you type 750 ml, which is the size of a bottle. This is in Google. Type the name of the wine, type 750 ml, and then type the area code, 917 or 212 or 415. That often pulls up stores that have that wine.
Is anybody taking notes on this, by the
This is
way?
that's my secret. I've given you my
This is
secret
a good tip.
food and wine researching how to find wine information.
Right, absolutely. And still keeping on the line of costs of wine, we're thinking about inflation and how much things cost. So much more. The wine category has really skyrocketed in a post-2020 world, and there's a bunch of reasons that go into it, and I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so prices of wine have skyrocketed in some ways. The prestige and kind of benchmark regions of the world, there's no question that the prices have gone up. I mean, I think if you look at tonnage prices, the average Napa Valley Cabernet is around $80 now, or $85, something like that. If you look at Burgundy, even a village Burgundy from a negociant producer like Jadot or Gevrey Chambertin will be $75, $80. That's a lot of money for a baseline wine. At the same time, there's so much more choice out there than there used to be, and there are actually so many really good values that it's a little bit of a weird situation where the really well-known and famous wines have shot up a lot, particularly like reference point superstar producers, whether it's Domaine du Jacques in Burgundy or top level Napa Cabernet, or it's Chateau Reyes and Chateauneuf. Those wines have gone through the roof in terms of prices. At the same time, like, just to pick a random wine, the País Salvaje from southern Chile that Jay Bouchon makes, that's just in the book, which is made from 120-year-old País, which is local vine to southern Chile, Mission here in California, which it was planted randomly, and the vines now climb up the trees next to this river, and he harvests them. They harvest them off the trees. That wine's $19 or $20 a bottle, and it's really cool. So while a lot of wines have shot up in price, there's all this great stuff out there that really hasn't, and is findable with some searching, and is, I think, super great. That technical wine term, super great.
Super great, yeah. And one of the things that really struck me about the book, and it's not just a wine guide, it really is a wine story guide. And that is what I'd like to dig into a little bit. We have, half the time left dedicated to stories and, of course, your questions. But there's some of the things that I read that really struck with me, some quotes in the book when you're talking about when you're drinking a bottle of wine, you're remembering the smells of the place that you're at, the person you're sitting across the table from, the moment that it's happening. You're thinking about the place to which you're at, and the vineyards, the land, the soil, if you're lucky enough to drink and taste with the winemakers like you are. But wine really is a combination of their story and your story, and how it intersects.
I mean, it's wine is incredibly contextual. Our experience of wine is incredibly contextual. So, which is one reason why I kind of talk in the book about why I'm not a giant fan of the numerical scoring system. And that sort of 92 points tastes like asphalt and blueberries. It's so only useful up to a certain point. And you're kind of like, all right, it has 92 points and tastes like blueberries. And I don't know, I guess it tastes like blueberries. But, you know, when you taste something, you taste it in a kind of a chemical level. You know, you taste it in it, your neurons in your tongue or your sensors in your tongue pick up, and then your olfactory sense pick up information and send it to your brain. It says it tastes like X. At the same time, this is all filtered by your brain, and so we've all had that experience, you know, where I mean, this is the classic example I use, is you are on the beach in Provence and you're with your, soon to be, or you're just married, you're with your newlywed spouse, whatever your spouse may be.
Literally had my honeymoon in Provence. So
yeah, so you go, and you're like on the beach in Provence, and you have this glass of rosé, and you're drinking it, and you go back to the hotel room, you have another glass of rosé, and then you're newlyweds, you do what you do in a hotel room as newlyweds, and you have another glass of rosé, and it's the best rosé you've ever had in your life.
I attest. It is literally the best.
Yeah, and this is not you, but then,
no,
10 years later, you're driving down the Jersey Turnpike, and you're on your way to your divorce lawyer, and you stop in at TGI Fridays, and you have the same rosé, and you're like, this tastes like dust and ashes. This is fucking horrible wine. And it's the same wine. You are different. And in a less extreme way, everybody's had this experience where you're on vacation in Europe or whatever, and you have a Chianti or something, and you come home and you find it in a store 6 months later, and you sip it at home, and you're like, this isn't the same wine I had. This is just not that exciting. It's kind of bleh. And it is the same wine. Okay, you are different. And so that contextual stuff matters a lot. And part of the point of the book is that, yes, your own experience is part of the context, but I think also the stories in the book, or the story, who made a wine, why they made it, how they made it, informs how you taste a wine. And so, for instance, and I pulled this bottle from the tasting we're going to have later, so we're one bottle short for the tasting, but this is a Hirsch Vineyard Pinot Noir, and so you can taste it, you can basically taste it and say, well, that's wine, definitely wine, and it tastes.
Oh well, hang on now, don't leave me out. Tastes like wine.
Tastes, it's kind of taste, tasty. And then
tasty wine.
Yeah,
love
you
it.
can say, then you can say, get a little more information. Say it's Pinot Noir. It's from the Sonoma Coast of California. It's from the far Sonoma Coast. Basically, go a little farther, you fall off a cliff and into the Pacific, and so it's very cool climate. A lot of wind off the Pacific. It's not a ripe style of wine. It's high acid, and you taste it knowing that, and it changes your experience a little because you know why it tastes the way it does. And then if I tell you that David Hirsch, was basically in the late 60s, early 70s, was kind of that, let's get back to the land and get the hell out of the rat race. Found land in Sonoma that was an old sheep station, no power, no water, no nothing. He was like, I'm just going to hide here away from civilization, which is crumbling, obviously, anyway. Some point he was walking with a friend through his land, and the friend was a winemaker, and the guy said, this could be really great Pinot Noir land, and David Hirsch was like, all right. And he liked wine, but he hadn't any plans to plant vines, and so he planted Pinot Noir and brought in and built this place, in the middle of, I don't know if anybody's been to Hirsch. It's in the middle of nowhere on the Sonoma Coast. It's very hard to get to. And created this vineyard that is one of the great Pinot Noir vineyards in California. And then about 6 or 7 years ago, I guess, he was in a very unfortunate tractor accident and nearly died, and has kept farming even though he's in a wheelchair at this point because of this tractor accident, and has this kind of indomitable will and is going to keep farming this place no matter what, despite everything that's happened. And then you taste the wine, And that changes your apprehension of that wine to me. That knowing that much about it, you can't then not know that when you taste the wine, and it deepens the experience. And not every wine has to be special all the time. A chef said to me at one point, like, look, sometimes rice is just rice. Okay, we can stop like completely freaking out about the rice, but in the right moment, and if you want to experience a wine, kind of fully, all that information really does kind of change your experience of it. And it doesn't change the flavor, but flavor is just a part of what goes on with wine. And so what I wanted to do with the book was tell all these stories of all these people. I mean, Etienne Guigal of Guigal in the Rhone, which is a very well-known brand, he was thrown out. Basically, his mother said to him, and this was when he was 8, and it was in France between the 2 world wars, and he was terrible poverty in France at the time. I mean, after World War I, though they supposedly won, the economy was destroyed. His mother said, basically, we don't have enough, the father was gone, dead. We don't have enough money to feed the family. You're the smartest of my 3 kids, so you need to go out and make your way in the world. And he's 8. So he gets a job assisting a shepherd. He is working in the snow with no shoes. He then eventually ends up harvesting fruit in the Rhone. He was harvesting apricots, I think. And one day his brother was there too at that point. And one day he looks up, and there's this vineyard, La Mouline, which is up in the hills in Hermitage, in Côte-Rôtie rather. And he's like, asked his brother, "What's the deal?" And his brother's like, "Oh, those are vines. Terrible, disastrous business. Don't go into it. You don't want it to have anything to do with grapevines. Keep harvesting apricots." And he's like, "Someday I'm going to buy that vineyard." And so he gets a job picking grapes. He eventually ends up, I'm pretty sure it was de la Frère, but he ends up being the director of a major Rhone winery. World War II happens. After World War II, he starts Guigal. He buys La Mouline, this vineyard he saw when he was 12. It makes one of the greatest Côte-Rôties in the world. And it's an extraordinary story. It's classic rags to riches, but it's also imagine being thrown out at 8 and your mother's like, you're the only one who's got a brain. You got to go do something. And he survived this and created a extremely successful across the world wine company. Again, it's like knowing that and tasting the wine, it really changes your experience of the wine. And so those are the stories that I wanted to get to in the book. I wanted to get, I didn't really care so much about 8 grams of titratable acidity and that it was in oak barrels for 36 months. I really wanted to get who the person was and why they're making wine and why they're making wine the way they do. And there are 290 stories like that in the book. Not all of them quite that dramatic, but that was what the ambition was. And then I had to cut 30,000 words because the publisher was like, we need to keep the book $50 or under, or no one's going to buy it. So it's like, really? Crap. So I've got a bunch of other stories that are just like on a computer at the moment. I don't.
Well, don't worry, we'll have time. You'll give us 2 more that didn't make the book. What I think is so interesting for you are able to, as a critic of wine, as someone who tastes wine, writes about wine for half your career, you're able to sit and have these experiences and these stories, and the average wine consumer isn't able to. But we're in a world now where I believe the story matters more, and they can search out and find them, whether it be online, obviously in your book, in these ways. And I feel like, do you think that the average consumer cares about the stories as much as they care about, say, top scores and tasting notes?
No, I don't. It's a funny thing. I would like them to care as much. I'm doing my corrective action so much as I can. There's a reason scores succeed, and that's because the way wine, there are 36,000, 40,000 different SKUs of wine in the U.S., maybe even more than that at this point. Everybody knows the experience. You walk into Bevmo or Total Wine or whatever, and there's a wall of 400 Chardonnays, and they, the analogy I make in the book is to chicken soup. It's like if you walked into a grocery store and there were 400 different kinds of chicken soup, and they ranged in price from like $1 a can to $70 a can, and they were all from different companies, And some of them were like single chicken soups, and some of them were chicken soups from specific chickens that were raised in a certain area, and some of them had little, and some of them had little descriptions on the back about how this chicken soup has like notes of this and notes of that. Weirdly, and none of them said it tasted like chicken, because no wine description ever says it tastes like grapes, And you would look at that in a store, and you would walk out and you would say, "This is insane. I'm never buying chicken soup again. I'm out." And that's walking in and looking at a wall of Chardonnay to some degree, and that's why scores work, because it's very hard for people, particularly who are regular average buyers who want a bottle of wine, to sort all this out. And scores are a very simple way of sorting out and saying, well, you should buy this one because it got 92 points and cost $27 rather than this one because it didn't. The problem for me is that it applies that it's kind of a false objectivity. It's like it isn't really 92 points. It's someone's opinion that it's 92 points. What can you do? I just think it's more fun to know the stories and know the people. And on a lot of wines, there's no story. A lot of wines, the story is a large, corporation decided it needed a $7 Chardonnay, and they did a consumer marketing research on 7 different brand names, and they landed on the one that is like appropriate for the kind of target audience they want, and they enzymatically modified the fermentations and keeps so that it's and used tea bags full of oat chips to give it oak flavor, and it's fine. It's like, use the analogy. It's like a Taco Bell taco. It's like a McDonald's hamburger. It's like a can of Coke. Tastes perfectly fine and totally fine if you want to drink it. I mean, it's like if I am mowing the lawn in Houston where I grew up in August and it's 105 degrees and someone comes by and it's like, do you want a Budweiser? I'll be like, yes, I would like a cold Budweiser. Thank you. I don't care if it's a mass-produced product. I would like it. So there's no reason, you can drink anything you like, but I do think you can get more out of wine if you really want to.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I think is also interesting in the book that you do touch on in some of these stories, some of these regions that people don't really think about. I mean, you had Walla Walla in there, you had Umbria. Yeah, obviously, it's different regions, and your experience going into these places and shining a spotlight on some of these smaller regions, or regions people just don't know as well.
I think that, we're in that context, we're kind of in a golden age of wine, because you can buy wine from everywhere right now. Like, I can walk down the street to a wine store here and I can find Slovenian white wines probably. And what's cool is there's a lot of really great wine being made all over the world in all kinds of regions, and by really ambitious people who are really passionate about what they do, and that's really wonderful. And I, we're right, in the neighborhood of Napa Valley and Sonoma, which are extraordinary wine regions, and I love their wines, but I also think the wines of southern Chile can be fascinating. I think, I've written about Pinot Noir from the southern part of Argentina, from Patagonia, which is great. There's tremendous wine being made in Lebanon right now. And it's there's great wine in Georgia, the country of. There's not so much great wine in the state of Georgia, but it's a little hot. There are some parameters, some baseline parameters about wine. It's, my hometown, Houston, not good for wine. Way too hot in the summer and way too wet. It's good for rotting grapes on the vine.
Well, it's funny. My mom texts me a couple of weeks ago. She's like, "Did you know they made wine in Georgia?" And I was like, "Mom, what?" She's like, "I'm watching 60 Minutes." So, she discovered this, and, I'm like, she's talking to me. I'm going, "Yes, Mom, I knew they made wine in Georgia. I have a bottle at home. Would you like to taste it?" But that got me thinking, of course, one of the things I also love about wine, and I know it's in your book within the context of story, is really the history, how it really, when you think about wine, it really goes along with the history of society, of humanity, with all of us. It's been there since the beginning, and it tells this story, a moment of time, in all kinds of different ways.
Yeah, I got lucky in finding wine as a topic because it's hedonistically pleasurable. It's great fun drinking wine. It tastes good, has alcohol in it. But it's interesting from an economic point of view. It's interesting from an agricultural point of view. It's interesting from a social point of view. It's interesting in the history of religion. It's culturally interesting going back thousands and thousands of years. It's a kind of inexhaustible topic, which is pretty cool. And I at some point, not when I was directly researching the book, but I did do a story about Georgia for food and wine. And the archaeological site that has the oldest evidence of winemaking is in Georgia, outside Tbilisi. And I went there, and it looks like most archaeological sites. It looks like a pit they dug in the ground. It's just only square, and they've got some, strings, kind of in certain places so they can keep track of what they're digging up. But it's kind of wild to stand there at this site and think that 8,000 years ago, someone right there was making wine in a Qvevri urn, basically, which is how traditional wine is still made in Georgia today. And it is this extraordinary history. And if you're I'm obviously obsessed with wine, it was really kind of a fascinating moment, and it was remarkable to think that that long ago someone was standing right there making wine. Then going off that night to drink wine in Tbilisi, made in the same way that they were making wine back then. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's incredible. And, one of the things I do love about wine, and I think we all do too, you say in the book, it's not about getting buzzed. It's really about being together with people. I mean, it's about connecting, how we communally come. We gather around the table. Often we have a bottle of wine. We have food. It is a way that connects us. And it also, for me, it connected me to the world. I didn't know about the world until I started traveling in the wine industry, learning about different cultures, and you start to understand them and how much more alike we are than we are different in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it does bind people that way, and it does bring together a lot of different cultures that would otherwise not necessarily connect. And it's pretty remarkable that in that context. I mean, there's some very funny moments. I was talking about Lebanon. Fawzi Issa, who is the winemaker and owner of Domaine de Tourelle in Lebanon, was one of the Lebanese winemakers I talked to are always like, okay, enough with the Civil War. It ended a long time ago. Can we just talk about our wines? They're like, because this is what the question they get all the time. But he was in Norway selling his wine shortly after the big explosion that it hit Beirut, and his Norwegian importer was like, I just don't know how you keep making wine in Lebanon. It's so difficult. And then Fawzi was like, you live in Norway. It's pitch black 6 months out of the year and cold as hell, and it's dark and wet, and I live in this place with sun 360 days a year, gorgeous fruit, and wonderful wine. I don't understand how you live your life. So, it was kind of, there's some wonderful connections between people in that context.
Absolutely. Cool. And we're going to get to the questions from the audience in a minute. But one story that didn't make the book that you want to share with us before we get to the audience.
Oh, gosh. There's so many stories that didn't make the book. I think that's an interesting one. I have to think on that.
Okay.
I mean,
the one story that did make the book that you want to share.
Oh, well, let's see. That Fawzi Issa story is a good one. I think there's a story. There's a Georgian winemaker who said to me, Georgia's had a complicated history of being part of the USSR and being overrun by the Soviets and overrun by everybody over time. And there's a monastery called Shabnavada, and there's the winemakers are monks, and one of the Brother Marcus, who's the head winemaker, said to me at one point, I was talking with him about the wine, and I was like, he had learned about wine from someone who was then basically killed by the KGB, and in the time when the Soviets were in charge of Georgia, and this is quite a bit later now, but I asked him something, and this is a little bit unrelated to that, but I asked him, what do you think about when you think about someone in Denver drinking your wine that was made here in this monastery in Georgia? And he said, and this comes from someone who's very deeply religious, obviously, but he said, well, I mean, we make our wine because of our belief in God, and God is in all of us, so it's not really that far from Denver to Georgia. And I thought, well, that's pretty cool.
There's the connection again. Here we
that's
are.
A connection.
Yeah.
That's kind of astonishing. And so that was one of those moments where you're like, this is such a amazing business to be in.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we have a lot of questions that I'm
Okay.
going to try to get to them. This one comes from online. It says, what is the biggest challenge facing the wine industry today?
Well, I think, I mean, a couple of challenges. One is clearly climate stuff, climate change, climate shifts. That was a constant theme in talking to winemakers in this book. Not just warming trends, which are global warming, whatever, but the fact that as climate changes happen, it disrupts weather patterns. And I think one of the best quotes in the book is from Philipp Wittmann at Wittmann, Weingut Wittmann in Germany, and he said, it used to be we had 1 year out of 10 that was just completely weird and unpredictable and the weather was strange. Now we have 9 years out of 10 where the weather's unpredictable and strange. And that was echoed by a lot of winemakers. So whether it's unseasonal hail or frosts, whether it's fires, obviously, whether it's crazy winds or super intense heat spikes, there's a lot of bizarre climate stuff happening that with any agricultural product, but particularly one that is so precisely farmed and to make into wine, that is a giant issue, I think.
Well, and it's an issue that they're tackling and working on. They don't have their head in the ground about it. I mean, they've been talking about coming up with solutions for the past 15 years, since I've only been doing it 15 years.
Yeah.
I don't have
winemakers are deeply conscious
they've been talking about it, yeah.
As everyone said, you can't yell at the sky. You have to just figure out what to do. But that's certainly one big issue.
That's a big issue. Okay, so next one coming from someone in the audience. If you could make one under the radar wine or wine region instantly famous, which one would it be and why? Oh, you're making it an influencer on Instagram.
If I could make a wine region
instantly
famous,
right now.
I would probably. It's hard to say which wine regions aren't famous, I guess, is one question. But I would, if I could make it even more famous, I would say Gredos in Spain, which is which is making some of the greatest Grenache on the planet. And it was a very beaten down region for a long, long time. And it's known in the business, but not really in the rest of outside the business that much. They deserve some fame, I think.
And why?
Because the wines are so gorgeous.
There you go. All right. For both Ray and Monique, what is your, sorry, I can't read the writing. What is your, I'm going to think it says, what is your favorite varietal of choice? Not just because of the season or food related, just your go-to.
I'll let you go first.
Well, champagne.
Yeah.
Always a reason to open up a bottle of sparkling wine in my best days and my worst. How's yours?
I think this is one of those questions that changes every single day, or rather the question stays the same, the answer changes every single day.
Of course.
But having just mentioned Grenache, I am in a Grenache moment at the moment. Whatever. There's something about that grape where it can make incredibly intense, powerful wines like Chateauneuf du Pape and make these gorgeous, transparent, silky, lightweight wines. I don't know if any people know Tribute to Grace here in California. Really beautiful wines. Angela Osborne's in the book, that kind of style of Grenache at the same time. So it's this chameleon-like grape that just does. I'm just fascinated with.
Well, and I did a trip, a Grenache trip just a year ago, and it was one of these things where until you're in the place with the people, you don't always fully appreciate the grape in and of itself. So I yes to Grenache, but when I'm not drinking sparkling wine,
right. Well,
247.
I have a weakness for champagne too. Gotta admit.
Okay, hi Ray. Have you ever considered scores in addition to your 100-point storytelling? Yes, no, just curious. Why not?
I've actually, absolutely. I mean, I've been asked multiple times. It's come up at Food and Wine a lot, and it's usually in the context of we could make more money if you guys did scores. And I've always resisted it. When I worked for Wine and Spirits, I did score wines because Wine and Spirits does that. And I internally kind of score wines for myself. I have a kind of rating system when I taste that is really more of a 5-point kind of little bell curve of fine, and whoa, that's kind of the scoring system I use. But I don't know, I've gotten away from it, and I'm just disinclined. I totally get why scores work, but I do think they're a little reductive.
Well, and I almost think the whole book is dedicated to the why. You don't
It
want to
is,
do
it
it, so
is,
read
yeah.
the book and you'll know the why. Buy the book.
Because it's like, what's
Yeah.
the score of, so does your score go up if you farm organically? I mean, do you get more points, 5 more points? I don't know. It doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah. Okay, this is an online question. What shift or trend do you anticipate for the wine industry in 2024?
I think in this coming year, it's a little hard to say. I think ongoing, like commercially, there's just a lot of pressure from different worlds right now on wine. There's kind of growing cannabis product, drinks, et cetera, which are going to cut into the wine market. There's been massive overproduction and a shrinking drinking rate in Europe in terms of wines. So I think it's a little tricky economically for wine right now. I'd like to think that 2024 will be positive. I've got a baseline optimistic attitude about wine in that there's a lot of sort of, the millennials aren't going to drink wine, and then now it's Gen Z isn't going to drink wine, and in truth, no one drank wine when I was in my 20s, except from a bag on a floor. But wine's been around for 8,000 years. I don't see it disappearing. It seems unlikely it'll just be wiped out overnight by cannabis drinks.
Or White Claw.
Or White Claw. I mean, White Claw did not succeed in wiping out wine.
It's still here. This isn't the question, but just adding to it, what are your thoughts on sort of the low alcohol, no alcohol category?
Well, that's a big thing. I think there's 2 things going on. One is that there's definitely a lot of people who are interested in low alcohol and NA drinks, non-alcoholic drinks, and there's definitely a growing market for them and a massive number of new products. I get pitched constantly on them. There's a somewhat a neo-prohibitionist movement, and it's kind of sort of under the aegis of health. At the same time, I think a lot of people, particularly younger people, are kind of like, well, maybe I don't want to get all as messed up as I could, which I think is maybe a good thing. I think, moderation in all things. Wine is not that alcoholic. If you drink moderate amounts of it, you won't end up on the floor, wondering where you were the next day.
And you mentioned backstage that it is the anniversary of the repeal of Prohibition.
Oh, yes, it is the anniversary today of the repeal of Prohibition. So,
you picked a wonderful day
cheers to that.
To drink wine. Okay, Another question. Does the quality or shape of the glassware make a difference in the taste of the wine?
It makes a difference in the aromatics of the wine, for sure. If you have a crappy glass that doesn't have a worthwhile shape, it will change the way the wine smells, and that will change the way the wine tastes, because so much of what we think of as taste is olfactory. Everybody knows this. If you have a cold, you can't taste anything. That's because you can't smell anything. Our tongue just does sweet, sour, bitter, salt, and umami, which is savoriness. That said, you can go over the top with the glassware thing. You do not need a single glass for every different variety, unless you have infinite cupboard space and are bored and need to spend your money on something. The thing that is underrated, and I do think is true, is that nice glassware feels better. It is better. It feels better holding it, and it feels better against your lips to have that thin rim as opposed to a big chunky glass. And is it a luxury? Sure, but if you've got a nice bottle of wine, why not have a nice glass? I mean, it seems fair. On the other hand, I've had, really hyper expensive Burgundy out of paper cups before.
I could be having a really bad Wednesday, and I pour a bottle of sparkling into my late mother-in-law's Baccarat crystal coupes, and I'm just having the best day ever. I feel so glamorous, and so, having this meaningful, beautiful experience enhances it.
Yeah, it again goes back to that, not everything has to be special all the time, and everything can be special in different ways.
Completely. Okay, I'm going to try to read this the best I can. I have a slight allergy to wine, am congested and sneezy the next days. Organic wines don't seem to have that reaction. Can you say why? Would biodynamic wines be similar? How do I look for organic or nearly organic wines?
Okay, so there's a lot of talk about this. And there's a couple of possibilities for the sneezy thing. One question is whether it's only red wines or whether it's all wines that do it to you. If it's red wines, it's probably caused by compounds that are in the skins of the grapes. The thought initially was that it was biogenic amines, which are naturally occurring, things like histamine and tyramine. Histamine, of course, if you take antihistamines, that clears you up. Histamine, which naturally occurs in red wines, is obviously clogs, if you have a reaction, clogs you up. Now, as of like 2 weeks ago, there's thoughts that scientific study that showed it might be a compound called quercetin, Quercetin, which is, again, naturally occurring in red wines. On the other hand, if it's both white and red, then it's not those compounds, and it could be a minor sulfite reaction, though most people don't have. A lot of people think they have sulfite reactions to wines. Most people don't have sulfite reactions to wines, and if you want to know if you're going to have a sulfite reaction to something, like have a dried apricot. That'll do you in right there.
Why do you think most people think that they have?
I think because sulfites are one, there's kind of there are red wine headaches for sure. People do get red wine headaches. This is the quercetin thing I was talking about. Sulfites have often gotten the blame. One, because they're labeled on the bottle as containing sulfites. Two, because some people, mostly people with asthma, do have sulfite reactions. Typically, if you have a sulfite reaction, it closes up your passages and you can't breathe very well, rather than give you a headache. It kind of has become a thing to say you have a sulfite issue. You probably have a different issue if you're getting headaches from wine.
It's five glasses.
If you're asthmatic and wine makes you, have trouble breathing, then by all means you probably have a sulfite concern. But there are lots of products like frozen potatoes and dried apricots, for instance, that tend to have much more sulfites because they work as antioxidants. And additionally, if you have a sulfite problem, you'll probably get a reaction from white wine more than red, because there tends to be slightly higher sulfites in white wine, because one thing sulfite does is keep things from turning brown. That was a very long not answer.
So,
but
it's a great answer.
Whoever's out there with the who gets the reaction, talk to me later and we can kind of figure out what wines are doing the deal. Maybe you're just allergic to Pinot Noir. I don't know.
Who knows? I can't believe we're almost out of time. Is there anything that I didn't ask you that you wanted to touch on?
I don't think so. I think we covered a lot of ground. I don't think there's any specific subject, really. We talked about kind of most of what I got into in the book. I did want to say, wine is really fun. Like, wine is a blast to drink, and it's fun to learn about. It's not, it's not like trigonometry. Well, okay, some people out there may like trigonometry. I don't know how many math majors there are, but it was not that fun for me. Learning about wine is fun because you learn it by drinking wine, and you learn cultural history, and you learn all sorts of things. And so there's a aspect of pretension around wine that I've spent my entire career trying to defuse. It shouldn't be pretentious. It's a delight to drink, and the stories are entertaining. And when I wrote the book, I wanted it to be a pleasure to read, not to be a technical treatise that would instantly make people go to sleep. And one of the biggest compliments I've got about the book, which I'm very gratified by, is people in the business who've said, basically most people in the business, the last thing they want to do is read a wine book. It's like, oh God, it's like reading a manual about plumbing if you're a plumber. It's just not that fun. And I've gotten a lot of feedback from people in the business who've really enjoyed it, which is cool because it's meant to be enjoyable. It's meant to be storytelling in a sense. Yeah. And
well, I think it's all those things. I actually think it's very useful, too. It's very useful to have. Like, it's a good, useful guide. With that, I'd love to close on one of the quotes that I just really loved from your book, if I can see it. Kristen was supposed to get me some readers or something, but I'm going to do my best. No, I'm kidding, Kristen. Wine is, after man, the most adept at telling stories. It is capable of broadcasting messages vast and ancient. It introduces itself with a complete set of identity papers. When I taste a wine, I taste everything that has ever happened in the land where it was raised. I meet the people who grew it, and I feel the hands that touched it. I know that sounds like a bit of a stretch to say that, but wine lives in and of itself.
Yes, and that was not me.
I know it wasn't.
That's Luigi Veronelli,
But it's a beautiful
who was a
quote.
brilliant Italian wine writer, and that's the heart of the book in a sense.
Yeah.
That's what that book is about.
Okay, I ask everybody this at the end. Do you have a cheers or a toast? Anything you say at your house, Ray?
We actually don't have a specific thing we say. Well, we say
You have
jokingly.
something. I know what he's got
We usually do this old joke, sort of Irish toast that's kind of.
I do it.
You know, here's to us. There weren't many of us, and now most of us are dead. But cheers.
Cheers. Okay, give it up. That is great. Okay, our thanks, of course, to Ray Isle, the author of The World in a Wine Glass, The Insider's Guide to Artisanal, Sustainable, Extraordinary Wines to Drink Now. We encourage everyone to purchase a copy of Ray's book here or at your local artisanal bookstore. And if you would like to support the club's efforts in making virtual and in-person programming possible, please visit their website at commonwealthclub.org. Monique Saltani, thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.